Welcome to the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Paul Regelbrug, Director of Education for the Holocaust Center. As people are joining, please take a moment to let us know where you're joining from in the chat. Today, I'm honored to lead today's Lunch and Learn featuring Serene Thin Elk. First, we wish to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands on the land that we now call Seattle. Living in harmony with the lands and waterways along Washington's Central Salish Sea, as they have for thousands of years, these people and groups continue to live and protect the land and waters of their ancestors for future generations. As Chief Seattle said in 1854, "Every part of this soil is sacred in the estimation of my people. Every hillside, every valley, every plain and grove has been hallowed by some sad or happy event in days long vanished." But acknowledging this land's origins only goes so far. What is important, as we've learned from conversations with tribal representatives, is to make land acknowledgements actionable. This year, more than ever, we're working steadfastly to develop and expand partnerships with tribal organizations in and around the Seattle area and across our Pacific Northwest region, as well as OSPI leadership around the since time immemorial curriculum. Why? We want to give the concept of memory, of remembrance, teeth, if you will. Last year, we successfully partnered with Densho to present a workshop in which we asked and discussed, what are the implications of memory? What does it mean to remember the past? Is mere remembrance of history like the Holocaust, Japanese-American incarceration, the transatlantic slave trade, and U.S. treatment of Native American people, including the long history of boarding schools, enough? We don't think so. We believe that these histories necessitate thoughtful, responsible civic action today, including allyship across individuals and organizations like ours. Because in allyship, in its optimal form, we embrace our shared humanity above all. In this spirit, we couldn't be more pleased than to introduce you to our featured guest today, Serene Thin Elk. Serene is an enrolled member of the Ihangtawan Oyate, Yankton Sioux tribe, and is a mother of 4 beautiful children. She currently serves as the Director of Indigenous Mindfulness at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition and is a licensed addiction and mental health clinician with 20 years of experience in the field. She holds a master's degree from Lesley University in expressive therapies and has helped to develop and facilitate cultural, clinical, and community-based programming within Native organizations throughout her career. We will take questions at the end of the program, but please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A at any time. Welcome, Serene, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm very excited to be here to share about our organization at NABS. We call it NABS for short. It's the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And I feel very, very privileged to be a part of this staff because we all enter into the spaces that we go into in honor of our elders and thinking of our ancestors and how all of those things that they endured for us to be here today through their lineage. It feels like the least that we can do in honoring them is to rise up and acknowledge their stories and be there and supporting them. They're working through all of the grief and pain and all the things they celebrate about life. There's so much in our collective history that is attempted to be, a collective sense of amnesia that things don't happen. And so I'm going to touch on some of the projects and initiatives that we have at NABS. So kind of looking at the truth, the justice part of things, and also the healing. and finally some resources at the end that I think really do highlight the work that we're doing, or I should say more, is parallel to the work that we're doing. So I'll talk more about those resources at the end. As you mentioned, I am the director of Indigenous Mindfulness, and a big part of the work that we do is education. And when we do that education, we want to make sure that we are also including the important stories of our elders. So I would like to just go ahead and get started here and share some more about the work that we're doing. And like Paul said, if there are any questions that come up along the way, if there's something that I'm sharing or saying that maybe you have more questions about or knowledge about, confusion, or maybe words of encouragement, a story, feel free during the course of this to type that into the chat. And then we will make sure that we're able to address as many of those comments or questions by the end of our time together. So as you can see, the title, Truth, Justice, and Intergenerational Healing, that's a big focus in the work that we're doing right now. And as a part of that, truth telling is looking at all of the layers of historical trauma and the timeline of US government policy. And so this is too much to dive into, but this is a wonderful timeline, a linear timeline that shows people from pre-contact all the way to where things are now. And still, yeah, there are a lot of things that are left out, but within the U.S. Indian policy that was implemented by the government against our will. These were just things that we're told that were going to happen to our people. The government did a lot of things to eradicate our people. When I say eradicate, and that's a pretty factual way of saying it. Genocidal policies written in plain writing in government documents, treaties that were never honored and still are not honored for land. And today, what we're going to be focusing on primarily is looking at the policy of the government boarding schools and how all of that leading up to that time in history, and from that moment, how that had such a huge impact on our collective spirit and our collective well-being and the collective trauma that we all experienced as a part of these policies. And so if you look in 1879, the first boarding school opened, and there were over 10,000 children from tribes all over in the US and the Alaskan territories that were sent to these federal off-reservation schools. So Carlisle is one that is often talked about. And hundreds of schools from that point on would be modeled after Carlisle. And in these schools, there would be a lot of, this is a continuation of some of the policies, and the visual here is to show from 1492 to invasion, removal, genocide, being placed in reservations, the assimilation process that happened through the boarding schools, and placing us on different lands, taking away our food. Millions and millions of buffalo were killed, because for many of us, especially in the plains, the buffalo it was a way of life. It was a relative, a very sacred relative to us that we honored and made offerings for, because we knew that that relative helped us to survive winters. It helped us to feed our people, to be clothed. And so when you think about some of the genocidal policies, it wasn't just against our people, it was also on the resources that we had. So land relocation, all of those things. The reorganization, termination, relocation, changes in boarding schools. So the boarding school era is a very, very difficult one to talk about. However, it is something that we need to, as a collective society, no matter what background we come from, acknowledge how the history has deeply impacted our Native people and our elders, who many of them that were taken from their families died in those schools. Many of them trying to leave those schools. Many of them, dying by abuse. And so we know that in those ways that they are survivors too. They survived something so horrendous that we have to also look at them as survivors in their own right. The length of our Native children's life after being taken away from their families and surviving maybe one day, or maybe they're still alive today to tell their story. They're all survivors for what they went through. And acknowledging this history is essential, because I think it helps a lot of people to understand why our people face so many adversities and why we struggle in a lot of ways. We also have so much beauty and so much wisdom within our communities, even through these attempts to take away all of our culture, all the way from making the young ones cut their hair when the moment they arrived, and not being able to speak our language, which for us isn't just a language, it's a way of connecting to spirit world, to their creator. All of these things, not only were they stolen, but they were assimilated and beaten if they didn't follow these new Christian ways. So things like loss of language, cultural disconnection, and intergenerational trauma are direct consequences of these institutions that these children were forced to go to. This is a picture over here on the right that one of the many that's used to show the before and after pictures of when our beautiful Native children came in with their clothing and their feathers or baskets, or their cultural things that connected them to one another, to traditional teachings. It connected them to the earth. It was our identity, our way of being was completely stripped of us by force. And you see the picture of the same three boys over on the right, which is they had to be clothed a certain way. Their hair had to be removed. And again, the goal was, as you know, or may not know, in the government documents, is to kill the Indian, but save the man. So the goal was to try to completely deny everything about them, even their skin color in these institutions. Some of the stories I've heard from the elders that we've worked with, that they would try to scrub their skin color off. And so in every single facet, the abuse and the trauma was present. So setting the context in the boarding schools, it begins in the 1800s. There are 523 U.S. Indian boarding schools and 408 government funded, supported, identified in DOI Truth Initiative, Volume 1. And then there were 115 financially independent and outside of DOI scope. So within those hundreds of schools, there was, the main goal was assimilation and genocide. And the thought was, if we are not able to take away all of their food to the point where they starve, or kill them in wars, what we're going to do is try to make them the way we want them to be, which is another form of genocide. Not only were children dying in these boarding schools due to severe abuse, they also were slowly losing culture, slowly losing connection to their spirit, which is a genocidal policy. And it's a genocidal way to take away the very core of their personhood and their humanity. So very often our Native children were forcibly abducted, sent hundreds of miles away, and as I mentioned before, haircuts and there's so many stories from different boarding schools of just being having to be stripped down and lots of humiliation and um, just really the cycles of abuse and shame were a daily thing for them. So if you think about if if you as a child were taken away and had to learn a new language, never would see your family again, were beat if you didn't do things a certain way, you can imagine on just a single level of an individual how much that would impact you, and turn you into a person who would have that fight, flight, or freeze response. Because in order to survive, to stay alive, one of those freeze responses or fight responses would have to kick in order for you to make it. So this is where we acknowledge that institutional racism and trauma is present, systemic trauma, and historical, which we know leads to intergenerational trauma. So at NABS, there's so many things that we do, and the vision really focuses on Indigenous cultural sovereignty and to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma created by the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. So that is really the focus of what we do. And within that, I wanted to highlight, and this is a bill that our CEO and another amazing advocate and staff member, Ponca Wee, had been working on for so long, and it got so close, but we weren't able to see it all the way through with bipartisan things. And so we're not giving up, but we do know that there has been so much education on this about how there needs to be a Truth and Hearing Commission that really looks at so much of the unknown history and is able to document these things so it's not forgotten in history. And so it is something that we will continue to advocate for, and we'll continue to find ways to really support our elders and our survivors and the descendants of those boarding schools. Even if they did not attend themselves, they often feel and experience the pain directly from their parent or grandparent. And I can get into that a little bit more, and how intergenerational trauma can be handed down generation to generation, both biologically and through just watching and observing behavior, also experiencing abuse that maybe their parents experienced in the boarding schools. It can happen epigenetically. There's a lot of ways that the impacts of this U.S. policy to have our children go into these schools continue to they continue to affect every single Indian person. Every single Native person has some level of being touched by these boarding schools. And that's why, so for so many of our people, we are finding such strength in being able to not just tell the truth, some of the educational stuff and the facts that we talk about. That's part of the truth telling. And a part of the justice is advocating for policy that really acknowledges the damage that was done and is continued and ongoing. So that justice part is equally as important to also to healing. This is one of our wonderful elders. She's also a board member. Her name is Ramona, and I wanted to highlight the Oral History Project as a part of what we do as NABS. We do a lot of educating. We have a team that does research. We have an archive team. We have, our leadership does so much advocating across both aisles and using their voices. And I'm just so proud of this Indigenous-led organization, and also for the OHP team. So OHP is Oral History Project. And this started in December of 2024. Or no, I apologize. It started some months before, but as of December 2024, we had our oral historians conducted 168 interviews during visits to Oklahoma, Alaska, Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, Utah, Michigan, and Hawaii. And we anticipate a number of visits in 2025 as well. I have the privilege of being a part of the oral history team and have watched, I would say with confidence, that I have had the privilege to watch intergenerational healing happen in real time at these visits. It starts with once we know where our sites are, we make community contacts and identify survivors who would be willing to share their story on camera. And so from the moment they walk in the door, if they sign up for this, we treat them with so much love and respect, as we know that through so much of their life, they were either shunned or shamed for being who they were or are, or not believed, or they just felt so traumatized they couldn't tell their story. And so it is so important to welcome them with warmth and love when they come through that door. And we all greet them and we all truly love them as our elders. And so they have their photograph taken, something very special and beautiful for them to have on their own. And we walk through the process with them so they understand. We also have a number of questions that they get beforehand. So to when they go into the interview room, they know, who is this person that's going to be interviewing me? And we have the best oral historians. They're so gentle and so knowledgeable, based in culture, and they're wonderful. And so they sit across from the survivor, the elder, and they spend an hour and a half to 2 hours, sometimes longer, going through these questions and telling their story. It's their narrative. And for many of them, it's the first time they've ever done that, and they're doing it on camera. And they agree to this, many of them saying they don't want the history to be misconstrued, ignored, or forgotten. They don't want it to be minimized, because they don't want what they went through to go without being seen, because they want the next generations to grow from that and to learn from that and to see that they too can have resiliency through those hard things. And I get emotional when I think about the stories that I've had the honor to sit with people and share. So when they get done with this interview process, they come and they would meet with our elder in residence, a wonderful, wonderful woman named Sandy Whitehawk. She does a lot of healing work and connects beautifully with our elders. And so she and I will have different times that we're on site. And after they're done telling their interview, they come into this space with us. We call it a quiet room. And we try to make it as cozy, and we have smudge available for them to smell the medicines and maybe cleanse themselves. We make sure they're okay with water or food, and we just want to take care of them. And our job when they come to meet with us after doing their interview is to decompress, to release, to have a time to process something that they talked about that was so hard. And so when you're holding that space for someone who told their story, often very traumatic, and they come out of that room and they come into the quiet room, that therapeutic space with you, you have a whole spectrum of emotions that can come along with that. And we're prepared for that because we understand the nature of, I guess people would call it in the westernized term, PTSD. It's a good attempt to kind of encapsulate symptoms, but it for us it's a different name. It would go deeper. It would be a soul wound. It would be generational trauma, generation after generation exposed to it. PTSD is often implied to say that at some point there was a baseline feeling of safety, and was an event or events that then brought that. And we know for our people that what has not been our baseline since colonialism came over, started to take over with slavery and genocide and all of those things. And so I'm in the process of really trying to understand and value Western ways of looking at healing and PTSD. We're also looking at what we experience is so enormous, and our strength is so powerful to have endured the things that we've been through. And so when they sit with us after telling their stories, and earlier I said, I have had the honor to witness intergenerational healing in real time, has been sitting with people who are sometimes going back to being that younger person, and they talk about being 5 and not knowing why they were going somewhere. Some of them thought they were going maybe on a fun vacation. Some of them didn't understand, oh, I'll be home in a couple days. I'm not sure what this is. And they find themselves in this place that was nothing short of hell for them. And so, as someone who did not go through that, but someone who feels very deeply and is of lineage of people who went through boarding school, when I hear them talk about themselves and that inner child and the fear that they felt, and the ability for us to sit and hold that with them. And sometimes they say, "You're the only person that has ever believed me. My family didn't believe me. Non-native people didn't believe me." That alone is powerful. But when you have a generation, to let's say 2 or 3 generations in a room with that person who interviewed, sometimes they bring in a spouse, they bring in their children, and we'll have a family session. It's not therapy, but it's somewhere in between, because the work is so deep and it is so palpable and powerful that we will have someone come forth and say, I didn't realize until after I spoke all of that out in that interview room how this affected how I parented you. And they look at their children, and their children are crying. And you're holding this space for all of this pain that this family has endured because of these boarding schools and ongoing oppression after these boarding schools. And seeing them making those connections, they're no longer siloed in their pain and just the shame. It's being able to look outside of that and say, your pain, because of what I went through, is inevitably intertwined and interconnected. And so we have these conversations and lots of tears and healing, and we use our medicines to smudge, and we let them know that this is the beginning. This is just the beginning. And if you need ongoing support, we make sure to connect them to excuse me, to therapists or community talking circles, or at NABS we're really amping up our talking circles, our virtual ones, in-person ones, to make things more accessible for survivors, because we know that they deserve all the support, and using their voices that they can get. And so at NABS we really are prioritizing them, their hearts, their stories, and what we can do to continue advocating for them on some of those other levels. I wanted to share this. This is kind of a part of the truth telling. And so the OHP project is a lot of the truth telling as well. And it's also equally about the healing process, because after they go through that, telling their story, it's archived, it's on camera now, it's recorded. there's that part of now I'm processing the emotions of everything I shared. So another part of the truth telling is to really collect, preserve, and make accessible in digital archives some things that from historical records from these Indian boarding schools. So we have a team that's dedicated and amazing at preserving and finding pictures and organizing these pictures into different boarding schools that they're from, different timelines, so that this isn't just something that is scattered, like, oh, there's this one place where you can find this. It's an attempt to get this very, very exhaustive list, like, of all of these different places, and being able to archive them in a way. And it launched in spring of 2024, and they're doing amazing work. And I think that some of the things that they come across are very, very hard. And so the work that they do, I really like to lift them up, because they aren't doing in the interview rooms or maybe doing the therapeutic supporting, but they are seeing images, very disturbing things, very hard things, but every now and then coming across something really sweet, and seeing a friendship or maybe a note that was written, um, and just gathering these snapshots of the experience that I think a lot of the youth had, that most people would never see, and in its completeness, had these projects not started. So I'm really, really proud of NABS and all of the different things that we do. And there's so much that can always be done. And a lot of people do turn to us for lots of questions, and we hear everyone. And we also have to really focus in on the major initiatives that we have right now, which are really supporting and getting these stories told, documented, helping them to find resources so they don't have to suffer alone, and also making sure that we are creating spaces moving forward for them to convene and come together. There's many parts to this, but I did want to just mention a few resources as well and talk about them a little bit. If you're like me, when I go on a webinar, I hear someone talk, if I'm interested in learning more, I like to have some concrete things that can kind of help lead me to that path even deeper. And so there's one called The Fire Still Burns: Life in and After Residential School. It's by Sam George. Broken Circle: The Dark Legacy of Indian Residential Schools. And then there's those were both written by survivors of the residential or the boarding schools. This next book is not written by a survivor of boarding schools, but is more of a comprehensive collective look at what it takes to heal. And it's a really wonderful book by a therapist and activist named Prentice Hemphill. And in this book, they talk a lot about what does it mean to heal and what does it mean to create change in our world, and goes a lot into our ideas of trauma and how it affects our nervous system, and how she looks at these two things of activism, and how in a lot of the activism places or different communities, it's very much seen as go and fight. And that at times talking about healing feels very soft for some of those individuals. It feels like we're wasting our time doing that work when we have to be on the ground making change. And they come from both worlds. So they have a really strong insight into how we must first heal and look at inside of ourselves and ask ourselves, what are the things that are activating us? What are the belief systems that I hold on to as a person of color or a woman or whatever that may be, a queer person? What are these beliefs that society has imposed upon me that I have internalized that actually may be limiting me in my own healing and ability to make change in the world. And so I really like this book with so much going on in the world. There's so much going on with cycles of oppression and genocide, and it through all of time, this has happened. And if you look really close at a lot of indigenous values, excuse me, values, and specifically from the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, which I can speak a little bit from because that's where I'm from, is that even when these really painful, hard things happen to our people, our value system, wo Lakota, having compassion, wa ushila, those are our values that guide us to say, never again do we want this to happen to our people. And never do we want to become the oppressors and harm the oppressors in the ways that they did to us. That is not the goal. The goal is to learn how to heal collectively so we do not continue these cycles of power and oppression and land and all of these things that continue through time. So if we can start to change that narrative and look at ourselves and our own pain, because we all come from a people who have some lineage of pain, something that has affected the way that we've shown up in the world in not so good ways at times. And for a lot of our people, it's a lot of lateral violence within our communities. We harm each other when we really are needing to take care of each other. Before we can do that, we have to really learn how to be with ourselves and understand how the boarding schools and the genocide and all of that goes right down deep into who we are. And we can make choices from that, have behaviors from that, that maybe at one time helped us survive or be strong, but it's not sustainable. And so it's about acknowledging that ancestral energy that's also very strong. And I share some of these things from stories I've heard from my grandma and my mom and my dad and many other elders. The thing that our people want the most is healing. They want healing. And sometimes they want that to come in various forms, right? Healing isn't just this one-time event and then you feel better. Healing is an active, ongoing search for peace and dignity and belonging, but it's also about action. As Paul said in the beginning, these actionable items. And so it's a strong belief of mine that the work that we're doing at NABS with the different departments that focus on different things, it's such a beautiful holistic model because we have some people who are in DC advocating and saying this is why our survivors and our people need these things passed, this bill to be passed so we can provide support, not just the apologies that have been made, which are powerful in their own right, but there needs to be more steps moving forward to say, what does that really look like? What does that really look like for our people? And so using our voices and always taking time to balance it out to take breaks to heal and know that any person who comes from a lineage of this intergenerational and historical pain, um, my heart is with you because sometimes we have a lot of unconscious behaviors that drive us out of fear. And if we can learn to be in our bodies, especially as Native people, because we were taught so much to be ashamed of our skin color, of our hair, it's a revolutionary act at this point to be in your body, to feel your fear, to feel your pain, to feel your grief, and to be able to acknowledge that. That is healing. That's actionable. And it takes work. It takes work, but we do it in community. So that's a little bit about NABS. There's so many more moving parts to what we do, but our whole focus and mission is to bring truth, justice, and healing for our survivors. And knowing that the more that we bring healing to this, it heals everybody. It's not just our Native people. We together are focused on that. But when we heal and we find tools to heal and we can share stories, it's our way of giving. It's our way of giving. We're always giving gifts to each other, giving blankets, giving, honoring people. And as we learn, the hope is to be able to share with other people as well, because those are the value systems that we come from. So that's where I'm going to end at this time, and I think we're pretty close to the ending time. So I don't know if we have any questions or comments. We can be open to that now.
We do have some time for questions, Serene. And I just, first of all, I was furiously scribbling so many notes. This was such a heartfelt, thought-provoking presentation, really. And it just, your truths really resonate when they come from the heart. And you do that in spades. And so I just want to tell you on a personal, let alone a professional level, the power of this and its instructiveness as well towards our work as an organization as well. So I first want to start by thanking you. Um, one question I have, I wonder, so in this, because you've really, broadly, more increasingly broadly defined the concept of healing, and healing clearly connotes also an educational component so that it transcends uh, beyond just Native people, right? And so part of that is the act. And so I'd like to ask a little, the bill, the Senate bill. So I'd like to ask a little bit more about what your thoughts are relative to, change in administration and things, and what you're hearing relative to the potential success, right? Because it passed the Senate and then it sort of apparently got stopped up in the House and things like that. And I guess I just wonder what is sort of the new approach or the new intel, so to speak, regarding potentially getting this bill to become law?
Hmm. Yeah, so that would be a great question for Deb Parker, our amazing fearless leader. She's such a Deb Parker is our CEO. She's been taking the lead on that with Ponca Wee. And I'm not sure if she's on this call. If she is, I would tell her to maybe talk. But I know that they're put so much effort into that, so much effort, brought so much awareness to a lot of people who didn't even know about boarding schools and are in government and didn't know. And so they have a couple of kind of strategies and pathways right now that they're looking to try to do that. Um, and it may not be through the same pathways before that were tried. I think there's some alternative pathways to trying to get this move through. But yeah.
Thank you. Another question I have, I wonder about this. So, both on your website and in a recent article in the Seattle Times, which was sort of publishing information regarding discovery of over, 60 found children who died, were murdered in the boarding schools throughout across the Pacific Northwest. And apparently there were 17 boarding schools in the state of Washington alone. And I noticed looking at a map that only two or three of those boarding schools are actually on federally recognized tribal grounds or property. I wonder if are there any efforts or intentionality towards sort of creating some kind of things beyond just markers like monuments or memorializing in ways that may, to the extent that education is a part of the healing for all? I wonder what considerations there are relative towards noting these places and informing about these places.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of conversation about that, and people have different viewpoints. I think one of the places where people feel frozen in grief is knowing that they have relatives that are buried somewhere near the school that their child was at, and wanting for them to come home. And so it feels like it's an interesting thought about having a monument, because you would want to know where to do that, have to be
Mm.
really intentional, and maybe that's for every community to kind of decide. But the real movement is to find bodies, um, and oh, it's so it's so emotional just to think about. I have a 5-year old, and that's the age that children were being taken. And I heard so many of those stories from our elders that it has deeply impacted me, because I have a 5-year old and other children. But just to think about the grief of all the families that had a child go away and never came home and don't know where exactly they're buried. So when these graves are dug up and they find remains and they're able to bring them back to the community, that's the most healing.
Oh,
That is the most healing thing for the community. They have ceremony, they welcome them home, and it's this sigh of like our babies are back with us where they belong. And to be able to have that ceremony and acknowledgement of that. So I think the more science and money and understanding how funding we can have to undergo those efforts and find those bodies. And it gets even more complicated because a lot of roads have been built over graves of children. And so there's a lot there, many layers to that. But I think that asking the survivors and the families about how they would like to best remember. And then I think you're right. I think on beyond the levels of the families, just even for nationally, like to acknowledge that this is something that we do within our own communities ceremonially, but I also I also think nationally having some of those monuments placed. I don't know where they would go, but yeah.
thank you. And I'm really sorry just to even have to invoke these questions, right? I mean, it's just so, I was commenting to a colleague that what you're talking about is just so fresh and so real. It's just, in some instances, so many years later, but the effects are as if they occurred yesterday. And I can't even begin to imagine that level of pain. And as you indicate, though, healing is the path forward, the suggested route, and I really appreciate that. Um, Serene, another couple of questions that have come in that sort of like will lead me to bring up the last item that was on your recommended resource list, which was the uh, it's an Oscar-nominated documentary. For those that don't know, it's called Sugarcane, and as one commenter just noted, that it's available on Hulu for streaming and things. Now, that one will lead me as well to a question that Mona has just asked, and that is that so that takes place. The sugarcane is it takes place in British Columbia. So I wonder, there's this, attempt for memory and for healing and your work nationally in the United States. I wonder what the efforts look like in Canada for the First Nations groups. I wonder if there's uh, sort of reciprocity in terms of are there organizations working together in this where you're all contributing and learning from one another? Are Canadian efforts to uncover and teach and heal ahead of those in the United States? I wonder what you know, if anything, regarding efforts in Canada.
Yeah, so Canada has been doing amazing, powerful work with this for a long time. So I and there are some communities up there that are in touch with our organization or other organizations down here. I think that there's a general affinity and understanding. of what we both went through, what they went through, whether it was, across a country line or not. There were differences for sure, but there were so many similarities. And so a lot of times when you hear about like a wellness conference for boarding schools or different things like that, it's inclusive of people from Canada as well. I think we could probably do, better at those efforts too. The more foundation that we have here to, I know that a lot of people in our org have very strong contacts with people um, in Canada too. So yeah, there are relationships there.
Nice. I'm glad to hear that. Another question, and this came up from one of our participants. The question regards this. So a lot of the essence of your work is related to, studies about intergenerational trauma. And I saw even on your website, I think it was listed. Let's see, I have a note here somewhere. It was listed, one of the authors refers to sort of it using the term Holocaust, even, for example, and regarding the genocide. And what I wonder is, in the field of intergenerational trauma and studying the impacts of history upon persons and lives today, many similar conversations, as you can imagine or probably likely know, also occur, for example, relative to survivors of the Holocaust and their families, and Japanese American incarceration and their families and things. I wonder to what extent these other histories and work that's being done relative to those histories, that you're aware of them and or help inform what you do and vice versa. I wonder how things look in your field in that regard.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's imperative that we look beyond just what, of course, most of us are going to feel our hearts and our spirits
Mhm.
with our people. And I think that that's a part of healing for us, to not be ashamed of who we are, because that was the point of assimilation and beating our language out of us and cutting our hair, all that shame. So I just want to say that first, that I think this resurgence of connection and standing strong and saying we want to heal, we want to be activists, we need to do that. I believe that healthier of a community, the more healthy of a community we have, the more we are able to look beyond our pain and look towards other
Mhm.
cultures, other lineages who have gone through very similar things. May not be the exact time frame or the exact things, but there was human violation, there was genocide, there was displacement, there were all of those things. And on two things: one, honoring the differences and saying what you all went through, I did not know, and
Mhm.
that hurts my heart, you know. And on the other hand, saying we're kind of got some similarities here. And so if you look at a lot of the research, I think from indigenous folks and um, African American researchers that are in this field, it it gives me a lot of hope, because I think that we're also starting to try to deconstruct and decolonize these ideas of um, trauma and shame and all of those things, that we've had to have a label for what
Mhm.
we've gone through, and it's incredibly helpful in a lot of ways for people to get help. But on a bigger level, um, it's it's putting a label on somebody who was oppressed and victimized, like a child, that, oh, you have PTSD. And it's more, no, the system, like this literal system where this child was stolen and has spirit wounds, soul wounds. Their architecture of their brain is now different, shame about who they are. It's a normal response for that child to not be well, not feel a sense of belonging, not know how to connect in healthy ways, right? And so I think as I do more learning about different cultures and different times in history, I think the more we educate ourselves, I think the stronger we can become in our own healing because it's from a different perspective. And I don't know if you feel that way, but that's
Amen.
just sort of how I experience it too.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That's wonderful. Thank you. So we have time for one last question, and this is a question from Darlene. Darlene just asks, did President Biden's apology about the boarding schools last fall have an appreciable impact on the Native communities and on your work, for example?
I have definitely had the whole spectrum of
Hmm.
responses. I will say that when the apology came, we were on site in Salt Lake City and we were doing the interviews and we were with survivors who were already having a difficult time, a lot of them because they were telling their stories. And so we were surrounding them with love and support. And then the apology comes on the big screen. And so we got to watch it with them and the tears, the yelling, the excitement. I think on one big level, it was we didn't ever think that this would be acknowledged
Hmm.
because U.S. history has done these things and completely acted like they didn't happen. A lot of people cried. A lot of people felt like it was the right step forward. Others were angry. Others felt like, look at all the pain that's happened, and you say sorry, and now what? This
Yeah.
doesn't really change anything for what our communities face. And so it was people felt frustrated, like, what are your action items from here? Are you going to help us retain our language that was forcibly taken away by you, the government? Um, you know, so there's a lot of conversations about that, but I feel grateful for the apology because I think it's one step towards um, the building an awareness of our people are still here. Our people went through an atrocity, and we're going to continue to fight for our rights.
Thank you again, Serene. Again, I can't tell you enough. We sincerely appreciate your time and your presentation today. This has been really affecting and on many levels. Our next Lunch and Learn program will be on Tuesday, March 11th, Holocaust Conspiracy Theories, featuring Dr. Joseph Ushinsky. In addition, on Sunday, March 9, we're thrilled to feature Beverly Silver to share her family's story at our next Inheritors of Memory program at the center. And last for now, in April and May, our Holocaust Center in Seattle will be hosting the exhibit Anne Frank, Let Me Be Myself. Come visit us with your families, school or cultural groups, or just by yourself. We would love to engage with you. All of this work would not be possible without our outstanding team at the Holocaust Center. Special thanks to Richard Green, who's working behind the scenes on this program to ensure its success. And thank you as well to our entire team, including our Chief Executive Officer, Alana Cohn-Kennedy, Jessica Michaels, Lexi Jason, Branda Anderson, Lori Warshall-Cohen, Charlotte Campbell, Lisa Spink, Michael Langberg, Liz Hall, Arlene Luktu, Jess Alley, Mario Fayette Balamonte, and Rosa Campos. Thank you also to the Conference on Material Claims Against Germany for their support of this program. And thank you to all of you for watching today. We look forward to seeing you at our next Lunch and Learn program, which is on Tuesday, March 11th. Thank you again.